What if I told you that Japan's most feared suicide weapon in World War II wasn't stopped by bullets or bravery, but by something no bigger than a light bulb? Young pilots sealed themselves inside cockpits, fully convinced their sacrifice would sink the US fleet. But they never expected what met them in the skies over Okinawa. A tiny device, buried inside American shells, detonated midair with eerie precision, tearing kamikaze planes apart before they ever got close. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was science. This isn't just a story about war. It's about faith, sacrifice, and one forgotten invention that quietly decided who lived and who didn't. Stay with us, because once you understand what really happened that morning, you'll never look at World War II the same way again. What if the deadliest suicide weapons of World War II, Japan's kamikaze planes, weren't stopped by bullets, but by something they couldn't even see? April 6, 1945. Dawn breaks over the East China Sea. On the steel decks of American destroyers near Okinawa, sailors stare toward the haze. They know what's coming. Not a few, not dozens, hundreds. Kamikaze. Young Japanese pilots sealed in their cockpits, flying straight toward American ships with bombs and no intention of returning. But as they dive, something eerie happens. The sky erupts, black bursts that don't miss. Planes shatter mid-air, far from impact. It's as if the very air had turned against them. These weren't lucky shots. Inside those American shells was something new, something small, something alive with electricity. A fuse no bigger than a man's fist, yet powerful enough to kill an idea. The idea that pure spirit could overcome steel and science. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story might just change the way you see history. To understand how a hidden invention changed the fate of thousands, we must go back. Before the explosions, before the myth broke, back to a nation on the brink, and another preparing for a storm unlike any other. The morning of April 6, 1945, the skies above Kyushu trembled with thunder. But it wasn't nature. It was the roar of over 300 aircraft, fueled not just by gasoline but by final goodbyes. In a quiet airfield, young men, barely out of school uniforms, lined up beside battered Zero fighters. Some were sons of farmers, others university students who once dreamed of medicine, art, engineering. All of them were now soldiers of the divine wind. They drank sake in silence. Headbands marked with the rising sun were tied tight across foreheads. Officers handed them ceremonial swords, symbols of honor they would never use. Photographs of mothers, sweethearts, and childhood friends were tucked into flight suits. Each man carried more than bombs. They carried the weight of a nation's desperation. There were no illusions. They had been told they would die, and they believed it. Some even welcomed it. In training, they learned how to dive with precision, how to turn their bodies into guided missiles. One instructor whispered, "Think of the destroyer as your final destination. Hit it like a falling star." As the sun lifted over the horizon, villagers gathered along the runways. Mothers stood still, faces carved from stone. Fathers offered tight salutes. Children waved tiny flags, not fully understanding what the waving meant. The engines roared to life. The ground trembled. One by one, the kamikaze lifted into the sky. Small black dots rising into a pink dawn, destined never to return. Above the Pacific, American destroyers cruised on high alert. Inside steel hulls, sailors smoked in silence. Loaded shells were stacked, each one stamped with the letters VT, letters most didn't yet understand. But soon, they would. Two forces were now on a collision course, one fueled by devotion and sacrifice, the other armed with circuitry and science. Neither side would emerge untouched. By 1944, Japan stood on the edge of military and industrial collapse. The mighty carrier fleets that once thundered across Pearl Harbor and Midway had been sunk. American shipyards kept churning out steel giants. Japan, meanwhile, was starving for fuel, aluminum, and time. But the most devastating loss wasn't metal. It was people. Thousands of trained pilots had been killed in the battles of the Philippine Sea and the Marianas. Their replacements were teenagers with 100 flight hours, barely enough to handle takeoff. Training schools had become assembly lines of desperation. Strategists in Tokyo faced a brutal equation. They could surrender territory inch by inch, or gamble it all on a weapon that cost almost nothing, except a life. That gamble had a name: Tokubetsu Kogekitai, Special Attack Units. But the world would know them by a more haunting word: Kamikaze. The Divine Wind, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, proposed the tactic. His logic was grim, his math chilling. If one outdated Zero could crash into a destroyer, delivering 250 kilograms of explosives, it might sink a ship worth millions. One life traded for hundreds. And it wasn't just a military tactic. It became a cultural myth. Newspapers praised the purity of sacrifice. Propaganda films showed pilots bowing before shrines. School children were taught that to die for the emperor was to live forever. But behind the ceremonies were real young men, afraid, patriotic, torn between duty and survival. Some volunteered, others were pressured. Most accepted their fate with solemn silence. In the imperial mindset, technology had failed. Aircraft carriers could be sunk, factories could be bombed, but spirit could not be destroyed, or so they believed. So Japan began building weapons out of people. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the United States placed its faith in circuits, not ceremonies. A group of physicists in a quiet lab would soon challenge the very idea that sacrifice alone could win wars. The Kamikaze were rising, but so was something else, something no pilot could see. While Japan turned men into weapons, the United States tried something radically different, building a weapon that could think. In 1940, deep inside the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, a team of American scientists led by Dr. Merle Tuve began working on a problem that had haunted warfare for decades: how to hit something moving at 300 miles per hour through the sky. Before then, anti-aircraft gunners relied on mechanical fuses. They twisted dials, guessed at distance, and fired thousands of shells just to land one hit. Against fast-diving planes, success was more luck than science. Tuve's team had a vision, a fuse that didn't need to guess. One that carried its own tiny radar system, a transmitter, a receiver, and a split-second decision-maker. The idea sounded insane. How could a fragile glass vacuum tube survive being shot out of a naval gun, spinning 25,000 times per minute, slammed by forces 20,000 times gravity? The British had tried. They failed. The tubes shattered. The circuits fried. But America had something else: scale. Factories in Ohio, New Jersey, and beyond went to work. RCA, Sylvania, Eastman, Kodak, companies once known for radios and cameras, retooled to produce miniature electronic components. Women worked night shifts soldering wires thinner than a hair. Engineers redesigned glass to be tougher than steel. By 1943, it was ready. A fuse the size of a lemon containing 130 parts, each hand-assembled, each built to do the impossible: sense an enemy aircraft in flight and detonate before impact. They called it the VT fuse, short for variable time. The first tests were beyond promising. A shell didn't have to hit anymore. It only had to pass close. A near miss became a guaranteed kill. Suddenly, anti-aircraft fire wasn't blind. It was intelligent. The US military knew they had something game-changing. Production exploded. By 1945, 70,000 proximity fuses were made per day, each one a tiny machine of survival. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement. Where Japan chose sacrifice, America chose circuitry. Where one nation turned its suns into guided bombs, the other turned shells into something terrifyingly precise. And soon the skies over Okinawa would decide which doctrine would survive. The fuse was ready. But theory means nothing until the battlefield speaks. In early 1943, the cruiser USS Helena patrolled the waters off Guadalcanal. Enemy aircraft had been spotted. Her gunners, trained but weary, stood by their 5-inch guns. For years, they'd fired thousands of shells for every one plane they brought down. That day, they tried something new. 3 shells were loaded, each tipped with a device no sailor had ever seen before. Inside the steel casing was a secret, a tiny humming brain that could see through air. The first shell missed. The second didn't hit either. But then, a flash. A burst of black smoke in the sky. Midair. The Japanese dive bomber didn't explode from a direct hit. It exploded because the fuse had sensed it. It knew it was close enough. And in that moment, everything changed. The gun crews didn't cheer. They stood silent, stunned. One officer wrote in his log, "No contact." Still, the aircraft broke apart. It was like we'd reached out and swatted it from the sky. This was no fluke. Repeated tests proved it. The proximity fuse didn't just make every shell more deadly. It made every miss a potential kill. Soon, VT shells were shipped across the Pacific in crates stamped top secret. They were restricted to naval use at first, so vital, so revolutionary, that losing one to enemy hands was unthinkable. By 1944, sailors across destroyers began seeing strange letters on their ammunition. VT. Few knew what it meant. Fewer knew how it worked. But the results spoke louder than any briefing. Planes were falling earlier, closer, mid-dive. To the sailors under fire, it felt like their guns had become clairvoyant, firing not into empty sky, but into the exact place death was approaching. The tide had not yet turned, but a tremor had begun. Because the next time Kamikaze came screaming through the clouds, they wouldn't be diving into blind fire. They'd be diving into walls they couldn't see and wouldn't survive. April 6, 1945. The skies above Okinawa turned into a crucible of metal, fire, and belief. Nearly 300 kamikaze aircraft roared toward the American fleet. Zeros, dive bombers, even outdated trainers crammed with high explosives. Their orders were clear. Pierce the destroyer screen, reach the carriers, die with purpose. Aboard the USS Laffey, sailors stood at battle stations. Radar screamed, "Inbound." Bearing north, multiple bogies. Gunners loaded shells marked with two simple letters, VT. Most didn't know how the fuse worked. They just knew it worked. The first wave came low, skimming the waves. Others dove steep from clouds. Gun crews fired. Dozens of shells burst midair, not randomly but precisely where the planes flew. Black puffs tore into wings, sliced through fuselages. One pilot never even saw the burst that killed him. On the deck, cheers rang out, but only for a moment. For every plane destroyed, more came. The Laffey was struck by 6 kamikaze and 4 bombs in just 80 minutes. Flames ripped across her hull. Crewmen were thrown into the sea, but she didn't sink, because dozens of other planes had never reached her. Elsewhere, the destroyer USS Hadley fired 15 rounds per minute, downing 17 aircraft in under an hour. Aboard the USS Aaron Ward, a sailor said it felt like the shells were thinking for us. VT fuses detonated with unnatural timing, always too perfect to be luck. Still, not every ship survived. The USS Morrison was overwhelmed and sunk. The USS Drexler, out of VT ammunition, reverted to old-timed fuses. 2 planes got through. She sank in 60 seconds. 158 men died. The difference was clear. With proximity fuses, a ship could become a fortress. Without them, it was a floating target. For the Japanese pilots, the experience was horrifying. Doctrine had promised they would reach their targets. Instead, they were shredded mid-dive. One survivor later said, "It felt like the air itself was exploding." The ocean boiled with wreckage. Smoke choked the horizon. Screams of the wounded mixed with the roar of engines and fire. This was no longer war as Japan had imagined. This was death by calculation, delivered not by men but by circuits smaller than a finger. And for the first time, the kamikaze were afraid. The Battle of Okinawa was not fought from miles away. It was fought face to face. Machine versus flesh, belief versus precision. USS Morrison, after shooting down multiple attackers, was finally overwhelmed. Kamikaze struck her in rapid succession. The ship groaned, cracked, and disappeared beneath the waves. 152 men never came back. USS Drexler, out of proximity fuses, was left with nothing but outdated tech and prayers. Two kamikaze hit her in less than a minute. 158 sailors died. Survivors later admitted, once the VT shells ran out, we were sitting ducks. But the cost wasn't one-sided. For Japan, the toll was catastrophic. Hundreds of young men, many on their first and only mission, were obliterated mid-air. Their aircraft never touched steel. They died in the sky, torn apart by invisible bursts. Letters they'd written were never read. Rituals they performed the night before were vaporized with them. Some who survived abortive dives were haunted for life. One pilot recalled, "I saw my friend's plane vanish in a black cloud. No explosion, no fire, just gone. I knew then we were flying into death, not glory." Admiral Matome Ugaki, directing operations from Kyushu, wrote bitterly in his diary, "Our aircraft are being destroyed at distances we once considered safe. The enemy's firepower has increased beyond belief." And still, they kept coming. For the Americans, victory was Pyrrhic. 36 ships sunk, 368 damaged, nearly 5,000 dead. The decks of destroyers were stained with blood and oil. Survivors crawled through smoke, dragged comrades from wreckage, and stared at the sky, waiting for the next shadow to fall. They lived, but many would never sleep soundly again. The price of survival was paid in memories. The smell of burning fuel, the sight of a plane diving with a human inside, eyes locked, moments before impact. And yet, amid this horror, one truth echoed across every ship. Without the VT fuse, it would have been worse. Much worse. The proximity fuse didn't just kill, it saved. It spared destroyers from vanishing. It gave gunners a chance. It bought time, one detonated shell at a time for thousands to live. But that didn't make the dying any less real. Because in war, every statistic has a name. By the time the skies cleared over Okinawa, the arithmetic of war was undeniable. Japan had launched nearly 2,000 kamikaze aircraft in just 10 major waves. Fewer than 1 in 4 reached their intended targets. For every destroyer scratched or scarred, dozens of young men had died in flames, often before they saw the sea below. It was a strategy born from desperation but undone by precision. For the United States Navy, the losses were horrific. Nearly 5,000 sailors killed. Some ships struck multiple times, others disappearing in under a minute. But commanders knew, without proximity fuses, those numbers would have doubled, perhaps tripled. Admiral Raymond Spruance, whose flagship USS Indianapolis was struck, later admitted, "The VT fuse saved countless ships and lives. It was the margin between bearable and unbearable losses." But the real lesson ran deeper than damage reports or casualty charts. Okinawa marked a turning point not just in battle, but in belief. Japan's doctrine had elevated self-sacrifice to the highest virtue. Die for the emperor. Crash into steel, turn blood into victory. But the proximity fuse shattered that myth. It showed that spirit, however noble, could not outfly velocity, could not outwit physics, could not override innovation. Technology had not just intercepted planes, it had intercepted ideology. For America, the war reaffirmed something profound, that science, properly wielded, could protect life, not just take it. That the factories back home, once building radios and flashbulbs, now forged survival into every circuit. And for the sailors who lived, the lesson was personal. It was in the quiet moments after the guns fell silent, in the letters they got to write home, in the children they lived to hold, in the knowledge that behind every click of the firing switch was a fuse built not just to kill, but to make sure they came home. Okinawa wasn't just a battle, it was a reckoning between two visions of war, one that spent lives to win and one that spent minds to save them. When the guns finally fell silent and Okinawa was secure, the legacy of the VT fuse was just beginning. It had saved ships, saved sailors, saved futures. In 1945, it was hailed, quietly, as one of the 3 most decisive technologies of the war, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. But unlike those others, it left no cities in ruin. It left men standing, alive, shaken, but breathing. Over 22 million proximity fuses were built during the war, each one smaller than a man's fist, each one a defiant answer to the question, how do we stop the unstoppable without sacrificing ourselves? The fuse's legacy lives on, in modern missile systems, satellite defense, even space exploration. But its truest impact is human. For every sailor who stood on the deck and watched death veer away, for every family who saw a loved one return from a battle he should never have survived. The proximity fuse wasn't just a weapon, it was a promise that in a world tearing itself apart, sometimes the smartest thing we can build is a way to keep each other alive. War stories often glorify courage, sacrifice, and heroism. But the story you just heard challenges something deeper. What if the true hero isn't the one who dies for their country, but the one who builds a way for others to live? The Kamikaze campaign was built on an idea that spirit alone could overcome machines, that human willpower could pierce steel, outrun radar, and defeat a technologically superior enemy. But what happened over Okinawa proved otherwise. It wasn't bravery that turned the tide, it was circuitry. It wasn't sacrifice that saved thousands of sailors, it was science. And that's the uncomfortable truth. In modern war, belief without tools becomes tragedy. Patriotism without protection becomes waste. The proximity fuse didn't just change how America fought, it changed why it fought. Instead of throwing lives at a problem, the US built a solution, and that choice, engineering over martyrdom, echoes far beyond 1945. Today we face different kinds of battles, pandemics, climate change, ideological extremism. The lesson remains the same. Sacrifice is noble, but it's not enough. Faith must be matched with function. Passion must be paired with precision, because in the end, progress isn't measured by how many are willing to die. It's measured by how hard we fight to keep people alive. The Kamikaze believed they were invincible through death. The proximity fuse proved that survival, quiet, uncelebrated, and powered by science, is the real victory. If this story moved you, don't just scroll past. Like this video to support meaningful storytelling. Comment below. Do you think technology makes war more humane, or just more efficient? And subscribe, because tomorrow's story isn't about death. It's about a life that changed a nation. We share these stories not to glorify war, but to understand it. To remember the cost, the choices, and the silent inventions that shaped the world we live in. Every click, every share, every conversation helps keep history alive. Not in textbooks, but in voices like yours. And if you're wondering what happened to the man who built the fuse, or how this invention led to the creation of modern missile systems and satellite defense, well, that's coming in our next video, so stay with us, because sometimes the smallest inventions leave the biggest echoes.